Wednesday, September 3, 1980, was the day that 19-year-old Demetra Parker was planning to check out of the Country Boy Inn in Dalton, Georgia. The manager of the motel was well aware of Ms. Parker's intention to leave that day. In the short time that she had been staying at the Country Boy Inn, the manager had come to know Parker as sweet and friendly, not only to him but also to others who were staying there. By 11:30 that morning, Parker had still not turned in her room key. Calls to her room went unanswered, and her car was conspicuously missing from the parking lot. So the manager went to room 253 to see if perhaps Parker had vacated the room and just forgot to drop off the key. The manager of the Country Boy Inn knocked. No answer. He turned the doorknob, and it was unlocked. Upon entering Demetra Parker's room, the manager was met with a gruesome, unbelievably horrifying scene. The room was in shambles. Furniture had been tossed around, the TV had been knocked to the floor, towels, bedding, and articles of clothing were scattered throughout. And there was blood. It was everywhere, splattered onto the furniture and soaked deep into the carpeting. In the center of it all lay Demetra Parker's completely exposed body, bathed in scarlet red and riddled with stab wounds too numerous to count. Authorities were called in immediately, and even seasoned law enforcement officers were shaken by the ghastly murder scene at the Country Boy Inn. Dalton Sheriff Jack Davis would later call it the most brutal murder he had ever investigated. My name is Michael, and this is the story of a young woman who, by all accounts, was a ray of sunshine. She was generous and trusting to a fault, and then she made the mistake of befriending a young married couple by the name of Danny and Janice Buttrum. Now, true crime is pretty much always violent in some way, but I have to warn you, the violence in this one is extreme, and the R word is a central part of the crime that was committed. The full newspaper article for my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and if you're interested in true crime that's a bit older and more obscure, please be sure to like and subscribe. Demetra Parker, described by her mother as a good Christian girl, was the youngest of 4 children and the daughter of Ray and Barbara Parker of Kenton, Tennessee. Kenton was, and still is, a small country town where everybody knows everybody, and indeed everybody knew young, beautiful Demetra. Parker graduated from Kenton High School in 1979, and many of her high school peers were in the habit of seeking advice from her, so much so that Parker's mother dubbed her the Ann Landers of Kenton, referring of course to the once famous advice columnist. Upon finishing high school, Demetra Parker was given a gently used 1975 Buick Riviera as a graduation gift from her parents. Her family wasn't particularly wealthy, but Ray Parker made enough at the Goodyear rubber plant in nearby Union City, Tennessee, to give his little girl something special to celebrate this important milestone in her life. Everyone in Kenton knew Demetra Parker as a girl who just radiated kindness. She sang in the choir at her local church, she was modest and polite, and she also loved helping people, which certainly explains why others gravitated toward her in times of need. And, notably, she was extremely trusting of others, something her mother had warned her against, and Parker also had a weakness for children. She found their chubby little cheeks irresistible, and Parker no doubt wanted to become a mother herself one day. Sadly, Demetra Parker's willingness to trust others and her love of children would eventually become contributing factors in her own demise. In July of 1980, Parker left Tennessee and relocated to Georgia in order to be near 23-year-old Henry Wallace, an old flame who was described in newspaper reports as Parker's boyfriend, although her mother made it sound more like she was pursuing him rather than dating him. In Dalton, Georgia, the self-proclaimed carpet capital of the world, jobs were plentiful at the time, and Henry Wallace was working in one of the many carpet mills there. By August of 1980, Demetra Parker had also found employment at a Dalton carpet mill. Parker, who had a very close relationship with her family, was planning to make the 5-hour drive from Dalton back to her hometown in Tennessee for a weekend visit. On Monday, September 1st, Demetra Parker told her mom, "I'll check out of the motel Wednesday night, stay with a girlfriend, pick up my check on Thursday, and start home." That was the last time Barbara Parker ever spoke with her youngest daughter. Demetra Parker, who was still in the process of getting settled in Dalton, was staying in room 253 at the Country Boy Inn. Money was tight, and the Country Boy Inn was all she could afford. It was the kind of place that rented rooms by the week, and it wasn't unusual to see the Whitfield County Sheriff's Department responding to domestic disputes there. But at $50 per week, the price was right, and Parker was just fine with the modest accommodations. Just a few doors down from Parker, room 243 was occupied by Danny and Janice Buttrum, a young married couple who had a 19-month-old toddler and another baby on the way. While Demetra Parker had grown up in a loving home with parents who worked hard to give her the very best that they could, the origin story of the Buttrums was essentially the polar opposite, especially where Janice Buttrum was concerned. Little is known about 28-year-old Danny Buttrum's early childhood except that, according to his mother, he was literally dropped on his head as a baby. And no, I'm not even kidding, he suffered a head injury as a result. It seems unlikely that this was the sole cause of problems that Buttrum would later have in life, but I think we can all agree that it certainly didn't help. Danny Buttrum grew up in Adairsville, Georgia, about 30 minutes south of Dalton, and by the age of 14, Buttrum had begun what would become a years-long pattern of alcohol and drug abuse, and Buttrum would also start to show signs that he had a violent streak in him. Buttrum's mother said he had spells where he became violent and destructive, and she said that he had attacked her with a butcher knife and scissors. Buttrum was also obsessed with sex, and he allegedly checked himself into a psychiatric facility because he was afraid that he might be unable to stop himself from R-wording someone. 17-year-old Janice Marie Buttrum, on the other hand, was not dropped on her head as a baby. No, her earliest days were much, much worse. On the day that Janice Buttrum was born, a deal was made. Buttrum's mother, Marie Beavers, immediately gave up her newborn baby girl to R.V. and Elizabeth Adcock in exchange for payment of the hospital bill. Ms. Beavers had apparently made this deal several times before when giving birth to previous children, and on that day, baby Janice was handed over to the middle-aged Adcocks who had recently lost their own baby to premature birth. It may be tempting to picture the Adcocks as a heartbroken couple who simply wanted a baby to love, and maybe that was true for a fleeting moment, but the Adcocks actually turned out to be horrible people who had absolutely no business raising a child. Baby Janice was never formally adopted by the Adcocks, but she took their last name. Their home was a filthy 3-room house with no indoor bathroom, and Mr. and Mrs. Adcock were heavy drinkers. Mrs. Adcock in particular was physically and verbally abusive toward young Janice, and instead of buying Janice new clothes or even getting hand-me-downs from friends and relatives, she was perfectly fine with having Janice go scavenging for clothes at the local garbage dump. Mrs. Adcock would then send Janice to Adairsville Elementary School in rags, and Janice reeked of the trash heap that those rags had been plucked from. On top of that, Mrs. Adcock had apparently taught Janice nothing about personal hygiene. Janice's hair was an unwashed mess, her body odor was overpowering, and it should come as no surprise that she was relentlessly bullied and teased at school. R.V. Adcock, Janice's foster father, died when she was 12, at which point Janice and Mrs. Adcock moved into a tiny travel trailer with Mrs. Adcock's new man, with Janice being forced to sleep in a broken-down van in the yard. A public health nurse reported overhearing Mrs. Adcock say to Janice, "This is not your house. I can make you leave at any time." A social worker by the name of Marvin Dickerson later reported hearing Mrs. Adcock tell Janice that she had bought her, referring to the hospital bill that the Adcocks had paid when Janice was born. According to Mrs. Adcock, Janice was her property. She owned the young girl. Dickerson would later testify in court that Janice, who was frequently absent from school, was the most neglected girl he had ever seen. Those absences from school resulted in a truancy hearing where Mrs. Adcock told Janice, in court, "I hate you and I never want to see you again." Janice Adcock inevitably found herself being shuffled through the state foster system, which, in comparison to living with Mrs. Adcock, might have actually been a relief. but spending her formative years in the Adcock household had taken a toll on Janice. At the age of 14, Janice Adcock reportedly spent the night with a pair of 27-year-old men because they promised to show her some love and affection. And then, at the age of 15, Janice Adcock met Danny Carl Buttrum, a 26-year-old divorced father of two, and the two got hitched within a month. Danny Buttrum was 11 years older than his new teenage wife, Janice, and much like the Adcocks, he was a heavy drinker and physically abusive. Not long after their marriage, they had a baby girl, Marlene, and soon after that, Danny Buttrum was caught driving drunk one too many times, landing him in a minimum security lockup. And on August 22, 1980, not long before meeting Demetra Parker at the Country Boy Inn, Danny Buttrum escaped from that facility. At the time when Demetra Parker met the Buttrums, Danny Buttrum was indeed wanted by authorities, but of course Parker had no way of knowing that. All she knew was that this seemingly nice couple had a cute little baby, and that led to a quick friendship of sorts. The Buttrums didn't have a car, so the ever-helpful Parker gave them rides here and there in the Buick Riviera that her parents had given her. They also asked Parker to babysit their 19-month-old Marlene, which of course Parker was happy to do. Demetra Parker showed the Buttrums nothing but kindness and generosity, which makes what they did to her all the more sickening. Speaking of which, I have to warn you that things are about to get very disturbing. On the night of Tuesday, September 2nd, Timothy Sexton and Donald Goforth were visiting Demetra Parker at the Country Boy Inn. The three friends were watching TV together, and Sexton and Goforth would later testify in court that they saw Danny Buttrum pass by Parker's motel room about 15 to 20 times that night. Parker, despite having struck up a casual friendship with the Buttrums, told her male companions that she was afraid of Danny Buttrum and asked one of them to lock the door. Christopher Busby, referred to for some reason as Leon Busby in newspaper reports, testified in court that he had been drinking with the Buttrums that night. Between 7 and 7:30 p.m., the Buttrums, along with their daughter Marlene, climbed into Busby's car to go and buy some beer. What was supposed to be a quick beer run turned into an outing that lasted a good 5 hours. While in the car, with Janice Buttrum in the back seat with Marlene, Danny Buttrum asked Busby if he knew where he could get a girl. Busby was acutely aware that Janice was right there in the car with them, so he asked, "Won't your wife get mad at you for talking like that?" Danny Buttrum replied, "No, as long as she gets to go with her first." The group made numerous stops during which Danny Buttrum propositioned 4 different women, all of whom were quick to refuse his drunken advances. Later that night, after the Buttrums had parted ways with Busby, and long after Parker's male companions had gone home, Danny and Janice Buttrum, still with little Marlene in tow, knocked on Demetra Parker's door at 4 a.m. When Parker answered the door, Janice Buttrum asked for a cigarette, but this was just a ruse. Danny Buttrum abruptly forced his way into the room and knocked Parker to the floor. A struggle quickly ensued. Janice Buttrum produced a pocket knife, and the two proceeded to take turns stabbing and R-wording Demetra Parker. Parker's frantic screams were heard by others in the motel, as would later be testified. And all of this took place in full view of 19-month-old Marlene, who was in the same motel room playing with the telephone. Before leaving the room, the Buttrums used the knife on Parker one last time to make sure that she was dead. They then took Parker's car keys and checkbook, and they helped themselves to some of her personal items. Janice Buttrum pocketed a ring and a barrette. The two then went back to their room with their daughter, where they washed themselves of Demetra Parker's blood, and then they gathered up their things. They took off in Parker's car, stopping at a truck stop at about 5 a.m. Danny Buttrum had worked at this place doing tire repairs, and he borrowed $20 from the manager. Before leaving, Buttrum told him, "I don't know if you know what's going on or not, but if anyone asks you, you have not seen us." The attack on Demetra Parker was prolonged, and it was brutal. Parker was very much alive for the majority of it, and she suffered tremendously until the end. By the time it was over, Parker had been stabbed nearly 100 times. For some, This kind of brutality might call to mind the case of Susan Wright, who stabbed her husband at least 193 times, but Susan Wright's frenzy of violence was most likely the product of years of abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her victim. Demetra Parker, however, had never done anything to invite this kind of assault from the Buttrums, whom she had only known for perhaps a week or two at most. An autopsy revealed 24 stab wounds to Parker's front neck area. She had been stabbed 67 times in the chest. There were stab wounds to her spine, a large cut to her private area, and her lower abdomen had been slashed. Danny Buttrum also confessed that he violated her with a plastic toothbrush holder. When officers arrived at the Country Boy Inn to examine the murder scene, the manager of the motel informed them that the Buttrums had vacated their room despite having been paid up for several more days. A quick search of the Buttrums' room revealed a bar of soap and a washcloth, which were both covered with blood, and with Demetra Parker's car being gone from the parking lot, authorities had a pretty good idea of who had driven off in it. Investigators tracked down Danny Buttrum's mother in Adairsville, Georgia, and learned that she had been contacted by her son. He had asked her to wire him some money in Pensacola, Florida, about a 6-hour drive from Dalton. An arrangement was set up in which the Buttrums would be expecting to pick up some money at a Western Union office. Less than 24 hours later, FBI agents found Danny Buttrum in Pensacola at the intersection of Palafox and Romana, not far from the Western Union location where they believed they would be getting their money. He was sitting in Demetra Parker's Buick Riviera, waiting for Janice Buttrum to return with food. The two were taken into custody, and little Marlene Buttrum was placed in the care of Danny Buttrum's mother in Adairsville. While being questioned by authorities, Danny Buttrum confessed to the murder. He told FBI agent Howard Cowgill that he had stabbed and R-worded Demetra Parker, and that confession would later be heard by the jury at his murder trial. News of the brutal murder of Demetra Parker spread quickly. Although Parker wasn't known in Dalton the way she was known in Kenton, Tennessee, the people of Dalton recognized her as one of their own. The Atlanta Constitution described Dalton, Georgia as a hard-working, church-going community, a description that could easily be applied to Parker's hometown of Kenton as well. Demetra Parker was a small-town girl, and the citizens of Dalton were pissed, to put it bluntly. A gas station cashier suggested that, had this crime been committed a few decades earlier, the Buttrums would have been lynched. Inmates at the county jail attacked Danny Buttrum, and both Buttrums had to be placed in isolation for their own safety. Many expressed outrage at this despicable crime. Parker's half-brother, Ewell Anderson, stated that there were so many mourners in and around Kenton, Tennessee, that 2 funerals had been held. Demetra Parker's father and her brother, Kenny Parker, attended the murder trial of Danny Buttrum. Her mother was too devastated and couldn't bring herself to go. Anderson described Mrs. Parker at her daughter's funeral and afterward. At the casket, she lost it. She broke down. She lost it, and I don't think she will ever get it back again. She just sits there and stares. I don't think that she will ever be capable again. Prosecutors sought the death penalty for both Buttrums, and Danny Buttrum's murder trial was held first. During the jury selection process, the defense tried and failed to get the trial moved out of Whitfield County, citing the flood of sensationalistic news reporting about the heinous crime that the Buttrums had committed. The case had received so much attention that it made it into the pages of the February 1981 issue of the crime magazine Inside Detective. Over the course of a week in March of 1981, a number of witnesses testified against Danny Buttrum. Among them was Hugh Don Smith, an inmate at the Whitfield County Jail, who testified that Buttrum had admitted to the murder and R-word of Demetra Parker. Janice Buttrum, in an effort to save her husband from death row, wrote a confession in which she claimed responsibility for the whole thing. She said that she had coerced her husband into R-wording and killing Parker. According to her confession, Janice Buttrum was jealous of the beautiful girl from Tennessee, and she was afraid Parker would steal her husband away from her. Whether or not Danny Buttrum's defense attorney actually tried to use Janice Buttrum's confession in the courtroom is unclear, but the prosecution would later use the confession against Janice Buttrum in her own murder trial. Danny Buttrum's defense boiled down to a psychiatrist's claim that Buttrum suffered from, quote, psychological intoxication, essentially trying to blame Buttrum's actions on his years of drug and alcohol abuse. The jury went into deliberations and carefully weighed both sides of the case. 15 minutes later, they declared Danny Buttrum guilty of all charges. At Buttrum's sentencing hearing, the same jury took all of 42 minutes to sentence him to death. Janice Buttrum, who was over 6 months pregnant when her husband was sentenced to die in the electric chair, gave birth to a baby girl on Wednesday, June 3rd. The baby was handed over to relatives, and Janice Buttrum's murder trial took place in August. Much like in her husband's trial, the evidence against Janice Buttrum was overwhelming. Georgia Bureau of Investigation agent Charles Johnson testified that Janice Buttrum told him that she had no remorse over the killing. An FBI agent by the name of McFall testified that Buttrum said to him, quote, "That girl sure didn't want to die." The jury in this trial returned with a guilty verdict in 45 minutes. At her sentencing hearing, Buttrum took back the confession she had previously written, the one where she claimed responsibility for everything, and instead she made up another ridiculous story. Her new version of events stated that she walked into Parker's motel room just as Demetra Parker and Danny Buttrum, quote, were fixing to have sex, suggesting that it was consensual. And according to Janice Buttrum, that was when she stabbed Parker once in the chest before leaving the room, never to return. In this version of events, the other 95 or so stab wounds were delivered by Danny Buttrum. This change in Janice Buttrum's story didn't make a shred of difference. The jury took 2 hours to condemn her to death. Buttrum burst into tears upon hearing the sentence in the courtroom. On September 8th, a little over a week after his wife was sentenced to death, Danny Buttrum took the sheet off of his jail cell bed, tied it to the bars of his cell, and ended his own life. The autopsy confirmed that he had died of asphyxiation due to hanging. In 1989, after 8 years on Georgia's death row, Janice Buttrum was granted a new sentencing hearing. She had originally been scheduled to die in the electric chair in 1987, but she was granted a stay of execution by a federal judge. In 1991, Buttrum struck a plea agreement with Whitfield County prosecutors, and her death sentence was reduced to 3 life terms without parole. However, a 1993 article in the Flint Journal suggests that Buttrum could become eligible for parole eventually. Hopefully, this is just a case of poor research on the part of the journalist who wrote it. I was unable to find any news of Janice Buttrum being released, and as far as I know, she is still alive and behind bars. It's really sad that cases like these make it so hard to trust others. Condolences to Demetra Parker's family and those who knew her, and as always, I would love to know what you think. Please be sure to leave your comments below, and thank you for watching.